The wind howled across the frozen wasteland like a creature in pain, and the snow fell in thick sheets that turned the world into nothing but white noise and cold death. But the alien woman kept walking because stopping meant dying, and dying meant her child would freeze alone in this terrible place. She was tall and thin with skin that shimmered pale blue in what little light came through the storm, and her eyes were large and dark like pools of ink that reflected no warmth at all. But right, now those eyes held only fear and determination as she clutched the small bundle against her chest and pushed forward through snow that came up past her knees. Her name was Lyra, and she had never expected to die on a primitive world so far from home, but the ship had malfunctioned during the jump, and by the time they realized something was wrong, it was too late. And the captain had ordered everyone to the escape pods, and she had grabbed her daughter and run. The pod had landed hard in the snow, and when she climbed out, she found herself alone in a blizzard with no supplies and no way to call for help. And the pod itself was already half buried, and its beacon was broken, and she knew that even if her people came looking, they would never find her in time. So she walked because that was all she could do, and she sang to her baby because the child was crying from the cold, and Lyra did not know what else to do, and her voice was soft and melodic, even though her throat hurt from the freezing air, and even though she knew it would not matter in the end. The song was old, and it came from her homeworld, and it spoke of warm seas and silver moons and the safety of family. But here there were no warm seas, and the sky was gray, with storm clouds, and her family was light years away and probably thought she was already dead. Her daughter was so small, and her name was Zara, and she had been born only 3 cycles ago, and she deserved to grow up and see beautiful things and learn the songs of their people, but instead she would freeze in her mother's arms on a world that did not know they existed, and would not care if it did. Lyra fell once and then twice, and each time it was harder to get back up, and the cold was seeping through her thin suit and making her fingers numb and her legs weak. But she forced herself to stand because lying down meant giving up, and she would not give up while her child still breathed. She found a cluster of rocks that broke the wind a little, and she huddled against them and wrapped herself around Zara and sang another song. And this one was about hope and perseverance. And it was a lie because she had no hope left, but she sang it anyway because what else could she do? The baby stopped crying after a while, and that scared Lyra more than anything because silence meant her daughter was too cold to protest anymore. And she pulled the child closer and breathed warm air on her tiny face and prayed to God she did not believe in that someone would find them. And then through the storm she saw lights, and at first she thought they were hallucinations because she was so cold and so tired, and her mind was starting to drift. But the lights got closer, and she heard sounds like engines and voices, and she tried to call out, but her voice was too weak. The humans found her there against the rocks with her baby in her arms, and they did not understand what they were seeing at first because aliens were not supposed to exist, and especially not here in the middle of nowhere in a blizzard. But then one of them moved closer and saw that she was alive. Her name was Beth, and she was a rescue worker who had been searching for lost hikers when her team picked up a strange heat signature on their scanner, and she had insisted they check it out even though the storm was getting worse. And now she was staring at something impossible. Beth called out to the others, and they came running, and they brought blankets and heat, packs and medical supplies, and they did not waste time asking questions, because whoever this person was, she was freezing to death, and so was the child in her arms. They wrapped Lyra in thermal blankets, and one of the team members, whose name was Greg, took the baby very gently and wrapped her in his jacket and held her close to keep her warm. And Lyra tried to protest, because she did not know these creatures and did not know if they would hurt her child. But she was too weak to fight. Beth spoke to her in a soft voice, and even though Lyra did not understand the words, she understood the tone, and she let herself be lifted onto a stretcher and carried to the vehicle that would take them down the mountain and away from the killing. Cold. The ride down was rough, and Lyra drifted in and out of consciousness, and every time she woke, she looked for Zara. And every time Greg showed her that the baby was safe and warm and still breathing, and that was enough to let her rest again. They brought her to a hospital in a small town, and the doctors there did not know what to make of her because she was clearly not human, but she was also clearly alive and in need of help. So they did what they could, and they set up monitors and gave her fluids and wrapped her in heated blankets. A woman named Claire, who was the head nurse, stayed with Lyra through the night, and she held her hand even though it felt strange and cold, and she spoke quietly about nothing important just so Lyra would know she was not alone. Zara was in an incubator in the room next door, and a pediatrician named Helen was watching her closely and trying to figure out what this strange child needed, and she was amazed because even though the baby was clearly not human, she responded to warmth and touch just like any human baby would. By morning the storm had passed and the news had spread, and suddenly there were government agents and military personnel and scientists all demanding access to the aliens. But Claire and the other hospital staff refused to let anyone disturb them until they were stable. A man named Peter, who worked for some federal agency, tried to push his way into the room, but Beth, who had found Lyra in the first place, stood in his way and told him that these were patients first and whatever else they were could wait until they were healthy enough to handle questions. Lyra woke fully on the second day, and she was afraid because she did not know where she was or what had happened to her daughter. But then Claire brought Zara to her and placed the baby in her arms, and Lyra wept because they were both alive, and that was more than she had dared to hope for. The humans tried to communicate with her, and at first it was impossible because they spoke different languages and had different ways of thinking. But Lyra was intelligent, and she began to pick up on patterns, and within days, she could understand simple words and phrases. She learned that the world was called Earth and that humans were the dominant species here and that they had never encountered aliens before, and many of them did not believe aliens existed until now, and she learned that some humans were afraid of her and others were curious, and a few, like Beth and Claire, simply wanted to help. Beth visited every day, and she brought books with pictures to help Lyra learn English, and she was patient and kind and never made Lyra feel like a specimen or a threat, and slowly they developed a friendship that crossed the boundaries of species. Lyra told them what she could about her people and her homeworld, and the accident that had brought her here, and she showed them pictures on a device she had salvaged from her suit, and the humans marveled at images of cities that floated in the sky and oceans that glowed with bioluminescent life. A linguist named Karen came to study Lyra's language, and she was fascinated by the melodic structure of it and the way certain concepts had no direct translation, and she worked with Lyra to create a basic dictionary that would help future communication. Meanwhile, Zara was growing stronger every day, and Helen, the pediatrician, discovered that the baby could eat modified human formula and that her physiology, while different, was not so alien that human medicine could not help her. And she shared her findings with the medical community, and suddenly doctors around the world were learning about alien biology. The government wanted to take Lyra and Zara to a secure facility for study, but there was a public outcry because the story had captured people's hearts, and they saw not an alien threat, but a mother who had fought to save her child, and they demanded that she be treated with dignity and respect. A lawyer named Susan took up Lyra's case pro bono, and she argued that regardless of where Lyra came from, she deserved basic rights, and that her daughter deserved protection under human law, and the case went viral. And suddenly, Lyra was not just an alien, but a symbol of maternal love that transcended species. The town where Lyra had been taken in rallied around her, and they set up a fund to help with expenses, and they donated clothes and toys for Zara, and they made it clear that as far as they were concerned, Lyra and her daughter were under their protection. Months passed, and Lyra learned more English, and she began to tell her story in her own words, and she spoke at conferences and on television, and she helped humans understand that the universe was bigger than they had imagined and that they were not alone. She also listened to human stories, and she learned about their history and their struggles and their hopes, and she was struck by how similar humans were to her own people, despite the differences in appearance. And she began to see Earth not as a prison but as a home. Scientists worked with Lyra to try to repair her pod's beacon and send a signal to her people, but the technology was too damaged, and they could not fix it with what they had, and Lyra accepted that she might never see her homeworld again, and she tried to make peace with that. A team of engineers led by a woman named Lisa began working on new technologies based on what Lyra could teach them about her people's science, and they made breakthroughs in energy production and materials, science and propulsion systems, and suddenly humanity was taking its first real steps toward the stars. Zara learned to walk and talk, and she grew up between two worlds, and she spoke both her mother's language and English, and she was a bridge between species and a symbol of what was possible. when different peoples chose cooperation over fear. Beth became Lyra's closest friend, and she helped her navigate human culture and society. And she was there when Lyra had bad days and missed her home, and she never judged her for the moments of sadness and grief. Claire stayed in touch too, and she loved to babysit Zara and watch the little girl play and grow, and she marveled at how quickly the child adapted to Earth and how she seemed to take the best of both species and blend them into something new. Lyra got a job working with Karen the linguist, and together they published papers on cross-species communication, and they developed programs to prepare humanity for the day when they would encounter other alien species. Because Lyra was certain that day would come, she also started a foundation with Susan the lawyer to advocate for the rights of any aliens who might come to Earth in the future, because she did not want others to go through what she had gone through, and she wanted to ensure that first contact would be peaceful and respectful. Years went by, and Lyra became a citizen of Earth through a special act of Congress, and she was the first non-human to receive such status, and it was both strange and wonderful to belong somewhere again, even if it was not the place she had been born. Zara grew into a remarkable young woman who was brilliant and curious and compassionate, and she wanted to be a pilot like her mother had been, and she dreamed of the day when she could fly between the stars and maybe find her mother's people. Lyra taught her everything she could remember about their homeworld and their culture and their history, and she made sure Zara knew where she came from, even though Earth was the only home the girl had ever really known. And then one day the scanners picked up a signal from deep space, and it was in Lyra's language, and it was a search pattern, and suddenly, after all these years, her people had found her and they were coming. The world held its breath as the alien ship entered Earth orbit, and there was fear and excitement and uncertainty. But Lyra went on television, and she spoke calmly, and she assured everyone that her people were not conquerors or invaders, and that they had come only to find her. The ship landed in a field outside the town where Lyra had been rescued, and she walked out to meet them with Zara by her side, and Beth and Claire and all the others who had become her family. And when the airlock opened and her sister stepped out, Lyra wept. They embraced and spoke in their own language, and Lyra's sister could not believe she was alive, because they had searched for so long and found nothing, and they had given up hope, and yet here she was, and she had survived and even thrived. But when Lyra's sister asked her to come home, Lyra hesitated, because Earth was her home now, and these humans were her family, and she could not just leave them behind, and she looked at Zara and knew her daughter felt the same way. So they made a new arrangement, and Lyra's people would establish an embassy on Earth, and there would be cultural exchange and trade and cooperation, and Lyra would serve as the ambassador, because no one knew both species better than she did, and Zara would train with her mother's people and learn to fly the ships of their civilization, and she would be the first of a new generation who belonged to both worlds and who would help build bridges between species across the stars. Beth and Claire and all the others celebrated, because their friend was not leaving and humanity was not alone anymore. And the future was full of possibilities that no one had imagined when they found a dying alien woman in the snow. All those years ago, Lyra stood with her daughter and her sister and her human friends, and she looked up at the stars, and she thought about how she had nearly died in the cold, and how these strange creatures had saved her without hesitation and without asking for anything in return. She thought about how fear could have turned them away, but instead they had chosen compassion, and how that choice had changed everything. Not just for her, but for both their species, and she knew that whatever challenges came next, they would face them together, because that was what humanity had taught her, and that was what she would carry with her for the rest of her life, and that was the message she would share with every species she encountered in the vast and lonely cosmos, that sometimes the greatest strength was not in weapons or technology, but in the simple act of reaching out to someone in need and offering help and warmth and hope, and that no one should ever have to die alone in the cold when there were others who could save them. And as she held her daughter's hand and smiled at her friends and her sister, she sang the song she had sung that terrible night in the blizzard, and this time it was not a lie, because she had hope now, and she had family, and she had a home. The song drifted across the field and up into the sky, and it spoke of warm seas and silver moons and the safety of family, And for the first time since she had crashed on this world, she truly believed in the words she was singing, and the humans who heard it did not understand all the words, but they understood the meaning. And they joined in with their own songs and their own languages. And together they made music that celebrated survival and friendship, and the bonds that connected all living things. Years later, when historians looked back on this moment, they would call it the beginning of Earth's golden age and the start of humanity's journey to the stars. And they would speak of Lyra and her daughter as the catalysts who changed everything. But to the people who were there that day, it was simpler than that, and it was about a mother who had fought to save her child, and the strangers who had helped her when she needed it most, and the family they had built together. In the aftermath, Lyra lived a long life, and she saw her daughter become a celebrated pilot and explorer, and she saw humanity reach out to the stars and make friends and allies among the civilizations they found, and she knew that she had played a part in making that possible. And when she was old and her time was running out, she gathered her family around her, and that family included both her own species and humans, and she told them that she had no regrets, and that being abandoned on Earth had been the greatest gift of her life, because it had taught her that kindness was universal, and that courage came in many forms, and that love was stronger than fear, and that family was not just about blood, but about the people who stood by you when everything else fell apart. She closed her eyes for the last time, surrounded by the people she loved, and the last thing she heard was Zara singing the old song about warm seas and silver moons and the safety of family, and she smiled because she knew that her daughter would carry that song forward, and she knew that as long as there were people who chose compassion over fear and hope over despair, the universe would be a little less cold and a little less lonely. And that was enough. That was everything.